Greetings, friends of liberty. Speaking of Hugheses, I must relate a brief story of a Hughes I met some years ago, travelling the road south to London, with Jevons on the reins, and I deeply absorbed in the third volume of Gibbons's recently published History of the Decline and Fall. By risking it on the road, we heard ahead a brief call of greeting, and saw a gentleman's carriage stopped at the roadside. The splendidly attired Admiral soon emerged and introduced himself as a Sir Edward Hughes, and he explaining his difficulty of a broken axle, I offered him a ride to the city, where his ship was berthed at the naval docks. We finding an immediate sympathy with each other, he regaled me at length as we rode of his time at the East Indies Station in the Indian Ocean, commanding that squadron, and whilst there engaging in no less than 5 fleet actions against that extraordinary French commander, Pierre-André de Suffren, in all of which he held his own against this Gallic master. No mean feat indeed. He also mentioned his mansion in Chigwell, and the sorry state of it, the upkeep being dear given its enormous dimensions, and that this mansion was once owned in the first half of the century by Sir Robert Knight, cashier of the South Sea Company, who had fled to the continent with his son to escape the confiscation of his ill-gotten gains. However, if we turn to the Hugheses of your own 21st century in America, we find today Mr. Coleman Hughes, graduate of Columbia University, who's written his first book, The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. Here our author both attempts to explain why colorblindness, as represented historically on the one hand by the early 19th and 20th century leaders of the civil rights movement, is the most moral policy, and secondly, how the emerging woke ideas of neoracism, represented on the other by MacArthur Genius Award winner Ibram Kendi, by Robin DiAngelo and others of their ilk, have achieved their present prominence. It is to combat this growing intellectual scourge that Coleman has set his pen to parchment. Given, however, that there are already so many books written both about the value of colorblindness and the idiotic racism of critical race theorists and their followers, he starts by asking a germane question. If race is really meaningless, and we should be colorblind, as most people believe, as he says, why write a whole book about it? The answer is simple. I didn't choose the topic of race. It chose me. What does he mean by this? He explains by describing briefly his own history, thereby introducing himself to us. A, as what you would call half black, half Hispanic. B, by noting that, for the most part, the people I grew up around seem to share my lack of interest in race. See how, when he went to a new grammar school, Newark Academy, and was one of only 4 black kids in his class of 60, the students there who had never felt black hair before constantly touched his large, voluminous afro in a curious but not malicious way. D, how when Newark Academy sent him to a People of Color conference in 2012, he was abruptly introduced to neo-racist ideas, such as that blackness was considered a kind of magic, and my skin color a beautiful enigma at the core of my identity, a slice of God inside my soul. And F, how, when he then graduated and went to Columbia, he got an even stronger dose of that self-same, unwelcome woke medicine. The first main building block of his argument is to deconstruct the idea of race. He's saying that the concept is partially socially constructed and partially natural. By that he means when human beings evolved, they tend to inhabit different geographical areas.
and these led to variations partly by genetic drift and partly in response to natural environmental pressures. So, for example, blacks became black, to my understanding, because it likely conferred evolutionary benefits in hot climates, and in addition, in some regions, developed a susceptibility to hemophilia because this trait conferred an advantage in offering resistance to malaria. At the same time, Coleman argues that the word black is also socially constructed because to a degree people still operate, for example, by the one-drop rule, which is artificial. He next proceeds by first reprising Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Coleman envisions a country that offers each child a rigorous education, equipping them with the necessary skills to mature into responsible adults. This America would boast a resilient economy with stable growth, infrequent recessions, and abundant job opportunities. It would be a place that provides comprehensive health care for its citizens and dedicates resources to help those who cannot help themselves. Having outlined his vision, he then makes the following points about color-blindness. He notes, A, how Robin DiAngelo, of course, is the opposite of colorblind, she having said, using her own racial stereotyping, I strive to be less white, to be less racially oppressive. B, how people like DiAngelo don't describe specific individuals, which is the opposite of what truly colorblind people, like the civil rights activist Zora Neale Hurston, do, who, for example, said, races have never done anything. What seems race achievement is the work of individuals. C, all the ways in which so-called anti-racists actually act like race is real and not a social construct at all, though they keep saying that. So, for example, they, number one, say that only black people can use the N-word. Number two, say that you shouldn't open a restaurant serving another food than your own race eats. And three, or believe in segregated dorms for different races in colleges. D, how with social media and with companies like Google, color blindness is under attack. When I Google color blindness, race, 9 of the 10 articles that appear argue that color blindness is wrong-headed, counterproductive, or racist. E, how often these Kendi types actually oppose policies like the normal funding of the police or the use of red light cameras that actually help or have helped minority communities. So either they're really stupid or racist themselves. His conclusion of this section is, despite what anti-racists say about themselves, if something A looks like a racist duck, B quacks like a racist duck, and C waddles like a racist duck, it's an Ibram Kendi duck. Moving to his next chapter, The Real History of Color Blindness, he now reviews the history of the heroes and events of the civil rights movement in America, starting with A, the Boston 19th century abolitionist Wendell Phillips, who didn't give up the fight for civil rights even after the Civil War and proposed his own version of the 14th Amendment, which read, "No state shall make any distinction in civil rights and privileges among the naturalized citizens of the United States on account of race, color, or descent." This amendment, as Coleman points out, would have made all Jim Crow laws illegal by default. Unfortunately, when the actual 14th Amendment was passed, Republicans watered it down, changing the wording to equal protection from any distinction. This weaker phrasing subsequently allowed separate but equal facilities that led to so many future problems in both schooling and public accommodations. B, Justice Harlan, whose famous lone dissent in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 acted as an inspiration to civil rights lawyers throughout the 20th century. Harlan had said in that dissent, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful." C. Coleman notes that after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, despite the fact that the act had specifically outlawed the use of quotas, institutions from federal and state governments to labor unions to private corporations to colleges began racially discriminating in favor of blacks in precisely the ways that the sponsors of the Civil Rights Act had promised would not happen. He attributes this change to the violence, looting, and rioting in many northern cities that intimidated politicians. D. Many leaders of the civil rights movement, King, Randolph, Wilkins, and others, were explicit in opposing reverse discrimination. E. How governmental policies, as those in COVID attempting to at first direct more funds and healthcare to minorities instead of the elderly, who are more vulnerable, are unpopular through the country. F. How often prominent neoracists are found and tolerated in academia, typical examples being the Yale psychiatrist Aruna Kilanani, who in her bigotry famously said she had fantasies of unloading a revolver into the head of any white person that got into my way, burying their body and wiping my bloody hands as I walked away relatively guiltless with a bounce in my step. His next section is entitled Neoracism in the Media, and so there are no lack of examples. He mentions that A. few years ago, a man was killed by police when an officer restrained him by kneeling on him with most of his body weight for over 10 minutes. There were signs that the man was in distress, but the officer persisted, and the man lost consciousness and eventually died. The brutal affair was captured on video. You might be thinking of George Floyd, but that's not the man I'm talking about. I'm talking about Tony Timpa. This, of course, was a typical case involving police brutality against whites that illustrated how racist the liberal media is. Coleman shows 10 white people unjustly killed by the police, whose names also are unknown because the media hardly bothered to mention their deaths. It was the death of a white person. Coleman concludes that if people had been as worried about Tony Timpa's death as they were about George Floyd's, police brutality might have been reduced. In essence, what he's saying is the phrase, hated by the woke. All lives matter. B, he mentions too our branch of New York Magazine, in 2020, made a video actually entitled, So What Exactly Are White People Superior At? New York Magazine forgot to mention chess, surfing, swimming, and all forms of STEM. In Why Neoracism is Spreading, he turns to the all-important and much debated question of the origins of this woke liberal racism. How does he imagine that D'Angelo's idea that white women don't have the right to cry in front of black women, and Kendi's idea that the fact that most hockey players are white indicates American, if not Canadian racism, originated? He gives 3 reasons. A, the Cold War and the War on Terror ended in the early 21st century, which means that the United States no longer has a scary foreign enemy to fight. This is an explanation sometimes proffered by objectivists. B, he blames also the decline of Christianity in American culture, which has created an ideological vacuum into which real neo-racism has been able to enter. This is an explanation you often hear from the religious, like Jordan Peterson and Benjamin Boyce. No more religious meaning. C, finally, his third explanation is that after 2013, something changed. What changed? He says 2013 is about the time that a critical mass of Americans had 2 pieces of tech, smartphones and social media. He argues that this is significant because he says that A, bad ideas and news on social media travel faster than good news, meaning that myths and half-truths can easily outrun the facts. Secondly, he says that because people are talking about these issues more, they're actually making themselves more racist just by talking about them. He claims the way to reduce racism is not by talking about race more, but by talking about race less, an important insight that many would-be anti-racists miss. In other words, racial talk makes racist thought. I disagree with all the reasons he's given here, but I'll wait on my criticisms until the final evaluation. Moving on to Chapter 5, the neo-racist narrative, he explicitly attacks some of the main tenets of this woke ideology, among which are that A, new acts of racial discrimination can undo the effects of past racial discrimination. He responds by saying, cycles of ethnic violence around the world show us again and again that a society doesn't overcome injustice by creating new forms of it. Very true. B, he attacks the neo-racist claim that white people have power in society, but black people don't, arguing that the top 4 most populous cities in America all have black mayors, the vice president is black, and the president was black not too long ago. There are black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. 2 of 9 Supreme Court justices are black. Regarding racial disparities, he uses his philosophy degree from Columbia to good effect, pointing out how, since different cultures value different activities, they tend to do better on some than others. Since, for example, hardly any Japanese play chess, there are hardly any Japanese grandmasters. But it would be silly to conclude because of this that Japanese are dumber than other ethnic groups. In his final chapter, he emphasizes how A, racism in America is continuing to decrease, pointing out, for example, that the second Unite the Right rally in 2018 in Washington got much less support than the first one in Charlottesville in 2017, when Heather Heyer was murdered. B, reparations are a bad idea unless you can't find a specific living person to compensate. C, how other countries who have engaged in the slave trade display not the slightest guilt about their part. D, how in some respects blacks have more cultural power than they ever have had, and I here would have to agree given how much more black faces are shown in the media and advertising and black music is played in public spaces than previously. E, finally, as solutions, he suggests, among others, number 1, to reaffirm in many different venues and public spaces the notion of color blindness, as he himself is doing precisely with this book. Number 2, using colorblind anonymous grading in colleges. And 3, in supporting affirmative action in the original sense of the term, aggressively recruiting minority candidates from less privileged backgrounds and then judging them by race-neutral standards. So now let's break down the positives and the negatives of this book. The positives. Number 1, Coleman writes or can write engagingly. And so, for example, the sections where he describes his own experiences growing up, blending the personal with the theoretical, worked well. Number 2, with his philosophical training, he's sharpened his analytical eye for contradictions, and thus gives us numerous insights about neoracists and the silly inconsistencies and fallacies they espouse. Number 3, his theme and focus on defending color blindness, the whole purpose of the book, is valuable, as well as his outlining the history and champions of color blindness in America. The negatives. Number 1, these general topics, racism, colorblindness, affirmative action, racial disparities, and critical race theory, have received enormous coverage over the last 50 to 70 years. Hundreds of highly qualified philosophers, economists, social scientists, professors, and educated laymen, ranging from Thomas Sowell to John McWhorter to Stephen Carter to Heather MacDonald to Douglas Murray to Charles Murray to James Lindsay to Gail Heriot, to Dinesh D'Souza, to Richard Epstein, to Herbert London, to Peter Wood, to Thomas Wood, to Ann Coulter, to Christopher Rufo, to Mary Lefkowitz, to Wilfred Riley, to Talib Starks, to Charles Love, to Walter Williams, to Jason Riley, to Ward Connerly, to Stephen Ferran, to Bob Zelnick, to John Ellis, to John Derbyshire, have addressed these issues. And these authors are one small fraction. All in all, for those who have exposed themselves to some reading in this area and kept up with current events, there's little new here. Number 2, Coleman exhibits, despite mentioning the importance of free speech, only a marginal understanding of the importance of general freedom. In other words, a free capitalistic society in fighting the ideology of neoracism and related issues. As I've documented on numerous videos on this channel, notably both in the 4-part series, The Actual Cause of Political Correctness, and in many book reviews, this woke ideology in general, and CRT in particular, has been created by the rights violations of A, public education, combined with B, the rights violating portions of the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 91. These two forces, governmental politicized education and morals legislation enforced by bureaucracies, have created, nurtured, and spread this ideologies from colleges and universities via its graduates to the wider society. Since more and more people go to college, when they graduate, they spread those ideas received there to the institutions of which they become a part. So when Coleman argues that America no longer has Russia as a Cold War opponent, completely irrelevant. Similarly, the decline of Christianity per se has nothing to do with the rise of wokeness, since the intensity and extent of Christian belief has been declining in the West since the Reformation for close to 600 years. Finally, his idea that bad news travels faster than good news nowadays is contradicted by the fact that you can see hundreds of pieces of good news every day that travel very quickly. His argument here appears Marxist in claiming that certain technologies are inherently destructive and determine the ideas of the people who use them, somehow separate from their ideology. This also can explain why the expression of peak critical race theory occurred sometime during 2020-2021 in the pandemic, and is in 2023-24 now not mentioned, at least, as much on regular and social media. Perhaps it's not mentioned as much because the ideology has lost part of its luster by simple exposure? But how could that be if social media still transmits the bits and bytes as quickly as it did in 2013? In addition, with all the visions that he gives us, that I mentioned in the beginning, of a better society, he doesn't explain the means how he wants to achieve that. The answer is in more freedom. Richard Epstein in Forbidden Grounds, which I reviewed here, for example, demonstrated the enormous value of freedom in fighting racism. And so, for example, he talks about having great education for children without ever pointing out that the public bad of public education is the reason why our education is so much worse than it could be, both ideologically and technically, and especially worse for minority students who suffer disproportionately under its intrinsic incompetence. Adding all these factors up, I'd give this, therefore, a C, C-. Wishing you all a very happy Valentine's Day evening, either with your beloved or in thinking of them. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.